Cremona, Italy, sometime around 1707. In a workshop lined with half-finished instruments, Antonio Stradivari is reworking the size of an instrument that, in his own lifetime, hadn't quite settled into a fixed shape yet, the cello. He shrinks the body down to a new pattern, later catalogued as the forma B, roughly 75.5 centimeters along the back. It isn't his first cello, it's his best one. And it works so well that, more than 300 years later, it's still essentially the blueprint most cellos in the world are built on. By the end of this video, you'll know what actually separates a cello from its instrument family relatives, why a hand-built cello can cost more than a new car before a single famous name gets attached to it, what real competing scientific theories try to explain the sound of the most valuable instruments on Earth, and about a study that quietly humbled almost everyone who assumed the answer was obvious. Keep one idea in your back pocket for all of it. You're not paying for wood and varnish. You're paying for 4 centuries of nobody being able to fully explain why it works. Here's misconception number 1, and it's the most basic one, that a cello is just a big violin, scaled up. It isn't a scaled copy of anything. The cello, viola, and violin are related instruments in the same family, all standardized largely through the same Cremonese workshops, but a cello is tuned a full octave and a fifth below a violin, played upright between the knees rather than tucked under the chin, braced against the floor with a metal end pin, and held with an entirely different bow grip. Its proportions aren't a violin's proportions stretched out evenly either. A true scale-up would produce an instrument too large for a human torso to reach around and play. Cremonese makers, Stradivari most successfully among them, spent decades compressing and reshaping the earlier, unwieldy bass violins of the 1600s into something a solo cellist could actually control. Other Cremonese makers, including Francesco Ruggeri, had already experimented with smaller-bodied cellos in the 1670s, shaving the instrument down towards something playable. Stradivari's forma B, arriving decades later, was less a single flash of inspiration than the final most successful draft of a problem the whole city of Cremona had been quietly working on for a generation. It was the end point of that project, not the starting one. The tuning itself gives away how deliberately different the instrument is, rather than just smaller scaled. A cello's 4 strings are tuned C, G, D, A, low to high, in the same ascending fifths pattern a violin uses, but pitched a full octave and a fifth lower, landing the cello's range close to the low end of the human singing voice, which is part of why cellists and audiences alike describe its tone as the closest string instrument to a human voice. That's not an accident of scaling. It's the specific design choice Cremonese makers converged on once they'd worked out how small they could make the body before the sound stopped working. So that's what a cello is. Here's why one costs what it costs, and the answer starts long before any instrument becomes famous. A professional quality hand-built cello, made today by a skilled independent luthier with no historical pedigree attached at all, routinely costs tens of thousands of dollars, and often more than a new car straight off a dealership lot, which in the US now averages somewhere around $50,000. None of that price is about age or a famous signature. It's about the economics of building one object, entirely by hand, the slow way. A car is assembled from thousands of components manufactured on automated lines, at a scale where each unit gets cheaper the more of them roll off the line. A cello is the opposite of that model in almost every respect. One craftsperson, one instrument, hundreds of hours of hand carving, fitting, and finishing, with no assembly line to spread the cost across. The wood alone breaks the car factory logic before any labor even starts. Spruce and maple for a cello's top and back need years just to dry out, and serious cello makers typically won't touch a piece of spruce until it's been seasoning for 12 to 15 years at minimum. Some luthiers hold their best material back for 30, even 50 years before it's considered ready. That means part of the wood inside a brand new 6-figure cello being finished this year was quietly drying in a stockroom since before some of its future owners were born. A car manufacturer would consider that kind of lead time absurd. A luthier considers it the minimum entry fee for decent tone. Then comes the labor itself, and none of it is automatable in the way a car door stamping is. A luthier carves the arch top and back by hand from solid wood blanks, checking thickness in dozens of spots by tapping and listening for the right pitch, because a plate carved a fraction of a millimeter too thick or thin changes the instrument's whole voice. The purfling, the thin decorative inlay traced around the edge, is cut and set by hand. The scroll at the top of the neck is carved, not molded. Varnish goes on in many thin layers over weeks, sometimes months, because rushing it changes how the wood ages under it for the following century. Multiply hundreds of hours of that kind of attention by one instrument, one craftsperson, zero economies of scale, and the sticker price stops looking mysterious. It starts looking like the honest hourly rate of a very slow, very unforgiving job. Which brings up misconception number 2, that once prices climb into the millions, what you're buying is essentially a very old, very rare piece of furniture. Value driven mainly by scarcity and age, the same logic as a 200-year-old chair. That's only part of the picture. Surviving instruments from the small handful of elite Cremonese workshops, Stradivari, the Amati family before him, Guarneri del Gesù alongside him, sit at the intersection of two different markets at once: musicians who want to actually play them, and collectors and institutions who treat them as investment-grade assets, the same way people treat rare art. A number that high isn't purely about wood and glue from 1707. It's about provenance, mystique, and a market built to reward exactly those things, the same forces that inflate a painting's price far past the cost of its canvas and pigment. Institutions and foundations now actively buy historic instruments, specifically as investments, then loan them out to major soloists rather than let a masterpiece sit in a vault untouched. A practice that keeps the instrument playable while still functioning. Financially, more like a blue-chip asset than a tool of the trade. That arrangement only makes sense if you accept that the price and the sound have become at least partly separate questions. One is about scarcity, history, and what a handful of wealthy buyers are willing to pay for both. The other is about what actually happens when a bow crosses a string, which is where this video is headed next, because it turns out that second question is far less settled than the price tags suggest. Quick pause, because it's worth naming the shape of the argument so far before going further. Everything covered up to here explains why cellos are expensive in general. It doesn't yet explain the specific centuries-old obsession with whether these particular old Italian instruments actually sound better, which is the part science has spent decades chasing without fully catching it. If this reframe of expensive compared to what is landing, liking helps this video reach more people who'd want the next part too, because it's where the real mystery starts. Because here's misconception number 3, and it's the one that surprises people the most, that modern science has basically solved the Stradivari mystery. It hasn't, not with any single agreed upon answer, though not for lack of serious attempts. One leading hypothesis points at climate. Antonio Stradivari's most celebrated instruments, including the former B cellos, were built during a stretch of Europe's history called the Monde Minimum, a roughly 70-year span of unusually low solar activity, running from 1645 to 1715, that produced long winters and cool summers across the continent. A tree ring researcher named Henri Grissino Meyer and his collaborators have shown that spruce grown during that period developed exceptionally narrow, uniform growth rings. The wood grew slower and more evenly than spruce typically does, and a comprehensive analysis of tree ring data from over 280 authenticated instruments confirmed that pattern shows up consistently in the wood Stradivari actually used. Slower, more even growth is exactly the kind of wood structure acousticians associate with better sound transmission. On this theory, Stradivari didn't just get lucky with his craftsmanship. He got lucky with the weather, decades before he ever picked up a chisel. He was born in 1644, a single year before the Monde Minimum's coldest stretch began, and his most celebrated instruments, cellos included, were built during his so-called golden period of 1700 to 1720. right as that 70-year cold snap was finally easing. If the climate hypothesis holds, the greatest maker in the history of the instrument built his masterpieces from a supply of wood that an ordinary century could never have grown. A completely different hypothesis points at chemistry instead. Joseph Nagavary, a biochemist at Texas A&M, spent decades arguing that Cremonese luthiers treated their wood with chemical preservatives, probably to protect against woodworm and fungal rot, both serious threats in humid workshop conditions, and that the treatment had a side effect nobody was originally going for. Analysis of wood from Stradivari and Guarneri instruments has turned up traces of borax, fluorides, and various mineral salts, chemical residue that doesn't belong in untreated spruce or maple. Nagavary's argument is that those minerals altered the wood's cell structure just enough to change how it vibrates, and the finding has since been reviewed and broadly credited by the American Chemical Society, even though plenty of luthiers and researchers still consider the climate explanation the stronger one. Two credible, evidence-backed theories. No consensus between them. And that's before even asking whether the Stradivari sound is something a listener can reliably detect at all, which is exactly the question a group of researchers decided to test directly, instead of arguing about it in the abstract. In 2010, the violin maker Joseph Curtin and researcher Claudia Fritz ran a controlled experiment at the International Violin Competition of Indianapolis. 17 accomplished players, a pool of 6 instruments including 2 genuine Stradivariuses and a Guarneri del Gesù, and a room with the lighting dimmed so nobody could see which violin was which. Players were simply asked to pick their favorite. New instruments won more often than old ones. Only 3 of the 17 players could even correctly guess which instruments were the old Italians. In 2014, Fritz's team ran a tighter, better controlled follow-up in Paris, this time with 10 professional soloists comparing 12 violins under fully double-blind conditions, and published the results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. 6 of the 10 soloists picked a new violin as their favorite over an 18th century Italian one. Reliably telling old from new, by ear or by feel, turned out to be something even elite professional players mostly couldn't do. Both studies focused on violins rather than cellos specifically, simply because violins are far more plentiful and easier to source in matched sets for an experiment. But the instruments share the same Cremonese lineage, the same wood and varnish folklore, and the same price logic, which is exactly why the finding rattled the string world as hard as it did. If a room full of elite soloists can't consistently pick the multi-million-dollar instrument out of a lineup, the sound alone was never fully carrying that price tag. That's misconception number 4, that the price obviously reflects an audibly, unmistakably superior sound, something anyone playing at a high enough level would instantly recognize. The actual data says something messier, that reputation, visual cues, and the psychological weight of a famous name shape a musician's judgment at least as much as the sound reaching their ears does. None of this proves old instruments don't sound different. It proves that different and better, under blind conditions, stop being the same claim. You're not paying for wood and varnish. You're paying for 4 centuries of nobody being able to fully explain why it works. Put the actual numbers next to each other, and the title's claim stops being a rhetorical flourish. A skilled independent luthier's new cello, tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes into 6 figures, for an instrument with 0 historical pedigree attached. A new car in the US in 2026, an average transaction price hovering around $50,000. And at the very top of the market, the Countess of Stanlin, ex Paganini, Stradivarius cello of 1707, built the same year as the former B breakthrough that opened this video, sold at auction for more than $6 million. That particular cello has a history almost too on the nose for this video. According to a long-standing account, it was rescued in Milan in 1822 from a wheelbarrow on its way to the municipal dump. 2 centuries later, luthier René Morel spent nearly 2 years on a meticulous restoration in New York, and the cello returned triumphantly to the concert stage at the World Cello Congress in 2000, before eventually selling for 8 figures shy of nothing. A wheelbarrow bound for a dump and a multi-million-dollar auction result are, remarkably, the same physical object, 200 years apart. None of that is a coincidence of storytelling either. It's roughly how the whole tier of the market behaves. Instruments with documented histories, whether triumphant or ignominious, tend to sell for more than nearly identical instruments, with a blank, uneventful past, because the story becomes part of what's being purchased. A cello that spent 2 centuries getting played by a legend, restored by a master, and nearly thrown away in between, is, in the eyes of that market, worth more than the same cello, with none of that behind it. Which says something quietly revealing about how much of the price was always about the object's biography, not only its acoustics. Every one of those numbers traces back to the same 4 corrections. Not a scaled-up violin, but its own carefully compressed design. Not expensive purely because it's old, but because it's handmade, one at a time, from wood that spent over a decade just drying before anyone touched it. Not a solved scientific mystery, but 2 rival evidence-backed theories that still don't agree. And not an obviously audible difference, but a blind test where professional soloists pick new instruments as often as old ones. Go back to that workshop in Cremona. Stradivari wasn't trying to invent a mystery science still hasn't cracked, or a market that would eventually price his instruments beyond nearly any other manufactured object on Earth. He was trying to make an unwieldy bass instrument, small enough for one person to actually play well. He solved that problem so completely that his solution is still the default shape of the instrument, 13 generations of cellists later. You're not paying for wood and varnish. You're paying for 4 centuries of nobody being able to fully explain why it works. And it turns out, for a market that stopped needing the explanation in order to keep paying. If this changed how you think about the next cello you hear, whether it's in an orchestra pit or a busking case on a street corner, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe if you want the next one of these. Tell me in the comments whether it was the wood aging economics, the blind test results, or the wheelbarrow story that got you. And if you made it this far, hitting that like button helps this reach someone who's never once wondered why a wooden box costs more than a car. One more thing, before you go, that never came up anywhere above, and it affects every cello ever built, not just the famous ones. Cellos are prone to a specific acoustic glitch called a wolf tone, a note, usually somewhere around F, that stutters and howls instead of ringing cleanly, caused by the vibrating string and the vibrating body of the instrument, falling out of sync and briefly cancelling each other out. It's such a persistent, well-known problem that cellists routinely clip a small weighted device called a wolf eliminator onto the string between the bridge and the tailpiece, specifically to damp that one troublesome frequency into submission. Some cellists chase the problem for years, adjusting the eliminator's exact position by millimeters, hunting for the one spot that tames the howl without dulling every note around it. Even the most expensive cello ever built, wood aged to perfection, chemistry and craftsmanship, both working exactly as intended, can still let out an ugly little howl on one particular note, a design flaw baked into the very physics that make the rest of the instrument sing.